That seat isn't meant for people like you. The words sliced through the pressurized cabin of Transatlantic Airways Flight 237. Victoria Palmer's thin smile never reached her eyes as she glared at Dr. Marcus Thompson's boarding pass, then back at him with undisguised suspicion. Passengers froze mid-motion. The distinguished professor stood motionless in the first-class cabin leather briefcase in hand. Behind him, economy passengers formed a bottleneck, their expressions ranging from awkward discomfort to morbid curiosity. "My ticket clearly shows seat 2A, Dr. Thompson replied, his voice calm but firm. Victoria's lips tightened. "Sir, there must be a mistake. I need you to step aside now." It was that word, now dripping with authority and dismissal, that changed everything. That single moment when dignity faced discrimination head-on at 30,000 feet. Have you ever witnessed that split second when someone decides whether to stay silent or speak up? When a lifetime of keeping the peace collides with the raw need for justice. In the next 10 minutes, 20 young voices would make that choice. Their decision would transform not just a flight, but an entire industry's approach to who belongs where and who gets to decide. This is their story. A story that asks, when dignity is on the line, where will you stand? Dr. Marcus Thompson wasn't looking for trouble. At 62, the sociology professor had spent his career analyzing systemic inequality, not confronting it in public showdowns. His salt and pepper hair framed a face with laugh lines around the eyes. The mark of someone who found joy in teaching, despite the weight of his subject matter. His wire-rimmed glasses and tweed jacket with worn leather patches at the elbows completed the quintessential professor look, though his students knew there was nothing stereotypical about his mind. For 30 years, he'd built Westlake University's sociology department into a powerhouse through groundbreaking papers on structural inequality. His book, Invisible Barriers, had become required reading nationwide. Last year's Martin Luther King Jr. Academic Achievement Award recognized his research on modern segregation. When systems fail, he often told his students, they don't fail everyone equally. But Dr. Thompson's understanding of discrimination wasn't purely academic. 25 years ago, arriving at his first conference as a young professor, the hotel clerk had directed him to the service entrance, despite his clearly displayed credentials. That night, alone in his room, he'd made a decision that shaped his career. He would study these patterns, not just suffer them. The most powerful response to discrimination, he taught, isn't outrage, it's understanding. Not just recognizing injustice, but learning exactly how it works, then taking it apart piece by piece. He lived this philosophy, choosing analysis over anger. It had protected his spirit from countless small cuts that came with being a black man in academia. It had also earned him respect that transcended racial boundaries. What he couldn't know as he approached Flight 237's first-class cabin with his university-upgraded ticket was that his lifetime of studying discrimination was about to collide with experiencing it in real time with 20 of his brightest students as witnesses. 20 students from Dr. Thompson's Structural Inequality in Modern Society seminar, scattered throughout economy class, excited about presenting their research at the International Sociology Conference in Paris. They were a living showcase of the diversity Dr. Thompson championed, different races, backgrounds, and perspectives, united by intellectual curiosity. Sophia Alvarez sat near the front, mentally rehearsing her presentation. The daughter of Mexican immigrants, she approached every class as if carrying her family's dreams. Her dark eyes missed nothing, her mind constantly connecting theory to reality. Where others saw isolated incidents, Sophia identified patterns. The system isn't broken, she'd once declared in class. It's functioning exactly as designed. The question is, designed for whom? Beside her, Trevor Williams adjusted his camera bag. The quiet documentarian had entered Dr. Thompson's class thinking he understood inequality from books and films. 3 months later, he'd approached the professor with humility. "I've been looking without seeing." Now his camera served a purpose beyond art, capturing truth that others missed. Maya Johnson flipped through a dog-eared legal casebook. The granddaughter of civil rights activists, She was already focused on her path to becoming a civil rights attorney. Dr. Thompson had recognized her potential, immediately challenging her to look beyond courtroom solutions to cultural shifts. Laws change behaviors, she'd written in her midterm, but culture changes attitudes. We need both. Then there was Daniel Reyes, the business major, who'd taken the class only to fulfill a humanities requirement. Initially skeptical of theoretical problems, he now applied economic analysis to discrimination cases, proving how bias damaged bottom lines. Professor, he'd said that morning, I've calculated how discrimination costs airlines annually in lawsuits and lost business. The numbers are staggering. Among the other students was Zoe Chen, who rarely spoke in class, but whose written work showed profound insight. I'm better with words on paper than in the air, she'd explained during office hours. Then there was James Okafor, a Nigerian exchange student, whose comparative analysis of American and African power structures had impressed even Dr. Thompson. The remaining students formed a constellation around these six, each with unique perspectives and reasons for following Dr. Thompson to Paris. They debated passionately in seminars, supported each other's research, and had formed study groups preparing for the conference. What none of them realized as they clutched their economy tickets in the boarding area was that they were about to experience the most powerful lesson of their academic careers, one that no textbook could fully prepare them for. Terminal 4 at JFK. International hummed with pre-flight energy announcements in multiple languages, rolling luggage wheels, harried travelers checking departure screens. The afternoon sun streamed through massive windows, casting long shadows across the busy concourse. Dr. Thompson stood with his students at the gate, their excited chatter a counterpoint to his calm presence. The first-class ticket in his hand still felt slightly foreign, a small luxury he rarely indulged in. The dean insisted the department secretary had told him when arranging the travel. Our keynote speaker deserves to arrive rested and ready to represent Westlake. He'd accepted graciously, though, not without a twinge of discomfort at special treatment. Now, as boarding time approached, he reviewed final details with the group. Everyone has their presentations backed up, he asked, glancing around the circle of eager faces. Nods and murmurs of confirmation rippled through the group. Hotel information and emergency contacts. Maya held up her meticulously organized travel folder. All set, Professor. Good. Remember, this conference isn't just about presenting. It's about engaging with scholars from around the world. Listen as much as you speak. Trevor adjusted his camera strap. The organizers cleared me to document the sessions as long as I'm discreet during presentations. Perfect. This will be valuable for future classes. Dr. Thompson checked his watch. Any last questions before we board? Sophia shifted her weight, an unusual display of nervousness. Do you think they'll take our work seriously? We're just undergraduates presenting alongside established researchers. Dr. Thompson's expression softened. Sophia, your analysis of racial coding and hiring algorithms is more rigorous than papers I've reviewed from tenured professors. You've all earned your place. Remember that. The boarding announcement crackled over speakers Transatlantic Airways Flight 237 to Paris, now boarding platinum members in first class. A ripple of excitement passed through the students for many. Their first international conference, their first trip to Europe. That's my cue, Dr. Thompson said, picking up his worn leather briefcase, a gift from his first graduate class. I'll see you all on board. Find your seats, get settled, and try not to start any international incidents before we've even left American airspace. Laughter lightened the moment. Several students gave him encouraging nods as he made his way toward the priority lane. Knock 'em dead with that keynote, Professor Daniel called. Dr. Thompson raised his hand in acknowledgement without looking back, mind shifting to the journey ahead. He couldn't know the most significant teaching moment of his career would begin not in Paris, but in the narrow aisle of an aircraft just minutes from now. Dr. Thompson approached the gate agent, Jessica Miller, who scanned his documents with practiced efficiency. Enjoy your flight, Dr. Thompson. Boarding through the left doorway. He nodded thanks and proceeded down the jet bridge, joining the stream of passengers. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the distinctive atmosphere enveloped him, that blend of recycled air upholstery and anticipation. At the entrance to first class stood Victoria Palmer, a woman in her early 50s, with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her transatlantic airways uniform was impeccably pressed, her smile professional but cold. "Welcome aboard," she said, her voice carrying practiced warmth. "Thank you," Dr. Thompson replied, handing her his boarding pass. "I'm in 2A. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Her eyes darted from his face to the boarding pass, and back, her smile freezing in place. In that split second, Dr. Thompson recognized a pattern he'd documented countless times. The moment when someone's presence is registered as unexpected, incongruent, out of place. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Victoria asked, her tone suddenly sharp. Dr. Thompson maintained his composure, despite the familiar tightening in his chest. "Yes, I'm certain. Seat 2A, first class." She held out her hand. "Let me see that boarding pass again." He handed it over, watching as she scrutinized it like a potential forgery. Through the curtain, dividing first class from economy, he saw other passengers being welcomed with simple nods and smiles, no additional verification required. A white businessman in an expensive suit breezed through with a warm, "Welcome back, Mr. Peterson." A woman with a designer handbag received a friendly, "Your usual drink before takeoff, Mrs. Donovan." But Dr. Thompson stood waiting while Victoria examined his legitimate ticket with unwarranted suspicion. "The system's been having issues today," she said, not meeting his eyes. "We've had several seating duplications. Step aside while I verify this." It wasn't a request, but a command delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. For a moment, Dr. Thompson considered the path of least resistance, stepping aside, waiting quietly, accepting whatever resolution she offered. It would certainly be easier, but as he stood at the threshold of first class, his ticket legitimately in her hand, he made a different choice. With quiet dignity, he said, "I'm happy to wait while you verify, but I'll need my boarding pass back. And I prefer to wait by my assigned seat, as other passengers have been allowed to do." Victoria's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. A simple boarding procedure had transformed into something else entirely. A test of wills, a negotiation of belonging, and the opening move in what would soon become a much larger confrontation. "Sir," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I'm following protocol. When there's a seating issue, passengers must wait here until it's resolved." Dr. Thompson noted how she emphasized passengers, as if the word applied differently to him than to others. "I understand protocol," he replied calmly, "but I'm curious why my boarding pass requires verification when others don't warrant the same scrutiny." A businessman with silver hair nodded at Victoria as he stowed his briefcase overhead. "No questions, no verification, no suspicion." "It's nothing personal," Victoria insisted, though her tone suggested otherwise. "As I said, the system has been glitchy today." "If it's a system-wide issue," Dr. Thompson observed, "I imagine you'd be checking everyone's boarding pass with equal diligence." Victoria's professional veneer cracked. "I don't appreciate what you're implying. Now step aside." She gestured toward the galley area, symbolically removing him from the first-class space she seemed determined to protect. Dr. Thompson remained motionless, his dignity intact. "I'm not implying anything. I'm observing a discrepancy in how protocols are applied." Victoria's cheeks flushed. She grabbed the cabin phone, eyes never leaving his. "I need to call the gate, and I would appreciate your cooperation while I sort this out." As she dialed, Dr. Thompson observed the reactions around him. Some passengers avoided looking in his direction, suddenly fascinated by safety cards. Others watched with unconcealed curiosity or discomfort. Standing in the galley, while Victoria spoke in urgent tones, Dr. Thompson felt a complex emotion wash over him. Not just indignation at being treated differently, but profound weariness at the familiarity of it all. How many times throughout his career had he been questioned, second-guessed, asked for additional credentials? How many times had he needed to prove he belonged in spaces others entered without challenge? The irony wasn't lost on him. Just that morning, he'd finalized his keynote on the subtle mechanisms of exclusion in supposedly meritocratic systems. Now he was experiencing a textbook example firsthand. Victoria hung up the phone. "The gate is busy. They said to use the printed manifest. She pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, flipping through with quick movements. Dr. Thompson waited, aware that economy passengers were now filing past, some glancing curiously at him, standing awkwardly in the galley. "I don't see a Dr. Thompson in first class," she announced with barely concealed satisfaction. "Perhaps check under M for Marcus," he suggested. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned again. No Marcus Thompson either. Dr. Thompson produced his university ID and driver's license. "My ticket was booked by Westlake University. There may be a notation about that." Victoria barely glanced at his identification. "Sir, I'm trying to help you, but I cannot find your name. I can offer you a seat in premium economy, which is quite comfortable." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Thompson interrupted firmly. "My ticket is for seat 2A. It was confirmed twice by the university. Please double-check your records or call someone with access to the complete system." Victoria's face hardened. "Sir, I understand you're disappointed, but—" "I'm not disappointed, Ms. Palmer," he corrected, spotting her name tag. "I'm concerned about why a valid ticket is being questioned based on an incomplete passenger list." Their standoff had begun attracting attention. Another flight attendant glanced over repeatedly. The purser hovered uncertainly nearby, and through the dividing curtain, the first of Dr. Thompson's students had begun to board, their excited chatter fading as they sensed the tension. A heavy-set man in row 3 muttered audibly to his seatmate, "Some people just don't know their place." The comment hung in the air, unaddressed by Victoria, but clearly heard by Dr. Thompson and several nearby passengers. It was the kind of moment that separated observers from participants, those who pretended not to hear from those who couldn't ignore the injustice unfolding before them. Dr. Thompson stood his ground, neither aggressive nor retreating, embodying the dignified persistence he'd always taught his students. He was simultaneously immense in his rightful assertion and invisible in Victoria's determined refusal to truly see him. This dissonance, being hypervisible and yet unseen, was a phenomenon he had analyzed academically for decades. Now, in the recycled air of Flight 237, theory was becoming lived experience, and the classroom was expanding far beyond what anyone aboard could have anticipated. The tense standoff was interrupted by a latecomer to first class. Richard Whitfield strode onto the plane like he owned it. At 55, his tailored charcoal suit and burgundy tie screamed money and privilege. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, his Italian leather briefcase swinging carelessly at his side. The gleam of his Rolex caught the cabin lights as he checked the time with an exaggerated flick of his wrist. "Last call for Mr. Whitfield," came the announcement over the PA system. The flight clearly held for his arrival. Victoria transformed instantly. The ice in her expression melted into warm deference, her posture shifting from rigid authority to welcoming accommodation. "Mr. Whitfield, we were concerned." Her voice now dripped with genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard." Richard barely acknowledged her, scanning the cabin with entitled impatience. "I'm in 2A, he announced without presenting a boarding pass. "I always sit in 2A. Dr. Thompson stepped forward. "Excuse me, but 2A is my assigned seat." Richard turned, seeing Dr. Thompson for the first time. His eyes performed a quick dismissive assessment, taking in the tweed jacket, sensible shoes, worn briefcase before turning back to Victoria, as if the professor were merely part of the aircraft fixtures. "There seems to be confusion," he said, addressing her directly. "I specifically requested 2A. I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 1 million miles." Victoria nodded vigorously. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield. You're absolutely right. There appears to be a system error." She cast a sideways glance at Dr. Thompson. "As I was explaining to this gentleman, we've had booking issues today." Dr. Thompson observed the interaction with clinical detachment, while absorbing the personal indignity of being discussed in the third person, while standing right there. Victoria hadn't even asked to see Richard's boarding pass. His mere assertion of belonging was sufficient evidence. "Mr. Whitfield," Dr. Thompson said, his voice carrying natural authority from decades in lecture halls, "I understand you prefer seat 2A. However, my boarding pass assigns me to that seat for this flight." Richard's attention shifted reluctantly to Dr. Thompson's expression, hovering between annoyance and disbelief. "Look, he said, his tone making clear this conversation was an inconvenience. I've been flying this route twice monthly for years. I always sit in 2A. He turned to Victoria for confirmation, which she readily provided. Mr. Whitfield is one of our most valued customers, she explained to Dr. Thompson, as if this settled the matter. I appreciate Mr. Whitfield's loyalty, Dr. Thompson replied evenly. However, that doesn't supersede a confirmed booking. Perhaps the manifest shows him in another first-class seat. Victoria's lips pressed into a tight line. Sir, as I've already explained, your name doesn't appear on my first-class manifest at all. Mr. Whitfield, however, is clearly listed for 2A. May I see that manifest? Dr. Thompson asked. That's confidential airline information, she replied quickly. Richard sighed dramatically, checking his watch again. I have an important meeting with the European Commission tomorrow. I specifically booked this flight and this seat to ensure I arrive properly rested. I don't have time for this situation. The way he hesitated before situation carried volumes of subtext, implying the real problem was how someone like Dr. Thompson could believe he belonged in first class at all. Victoria seized the opportunity. Sir, she said to Dr. Thompson, I can offer you a very comfortable seat in premium economy with additional legroom. Would that be acceptable? The offer was presented as generous accommodation, rather than what it actually was, an attempt to remove him from a space where his presence was being questioned. No, it would not be acceptable, Dr. Thompson replied firmly. My ticket is for seat 2A. I'd like to speak with the purser or captain. Richard scoffed. Some people simply don't understand how these things work. Dr. Thompson met his gaze directly. I understand perfectly how these things work, Mr. Whitfield. That's precisely the problem. A woman in row 4 shifted uncomfortably, then whispered to her husband. Is anyone going to say something? Economy passengers continued boarding, creating a bottleneck as the standoff in first class showed no signs of resolution. Among those waiting, Dr. Thompson could now see several of his students, their expressions shifting from excitement to confusion, as they observed their professor standing in the galley, his right to a seat being openly challenged. The confrontation had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. It had become a public negotiation of status, belonging, and the unwritten rules of who gets to occupy which spaces without question. As Dr. Thompson stood his ground with quiet dignity, he was acutely aware that this moment was rapidly becoming the kind of real-world case study he would normally analyze in the controlled environment of a classroom. Except now he wasn't the observer, he was the subject. The standoff had created palpable tension throughout the first-class cabin. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably, some pretending absorption in magazines or phones, others watching with undisguised interest. The bottleneck of economy passengers had grown, creating a ripple of delays and murmured questions. Victoria lowered her voice to a threatening whisper. Sir, you're delaying departure. If you continue being disruptive, I'll have no choice but to contact security. The implicit threat hung in the air: comply or be removed, possibly in handcuffs. It was a tactic Dr. Thompson had studied extensively, transforming the victim into the aggressor, recasting legitimate objection as disruption. I'm not being disruptive, he replied evenly. I'm requesting the seat I was assigned. If there's a delay, it's due to the airline's failure to honor a confirmed booking. Richard checked his watch again, sighing dramatically. This is ridiculous. Some people just don't know when to back down. Dr. Thompson turned to face him directly. This isn't about backing down. It's about basic fairness. If there truly is a duplicate booking, the airline has procedures that don't involve automatically assuming one passenger's claim supersedes another's. Richard's expression hardened. Look, I have an important meeting tomorrow. I paid for this seat. I always sit here. Nor am I, Dr. Thompson replied calmly, particularly when the evidence of this alleged glitch seems limited to an outdated manifest. Victoria's cheeks flushed with anger. Sir, I've explained multiple times. Now accept the premium economy seat I've offered, or what Dr. Thompson asked, his voice still measured, but carrying a new edge. You'll have me removed for requesting the seat on my boarding pass. Is that really the direction you want this to go? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Cabin crew, prepare for departure and report door status. Victoria's expression flickered with panic. She reached for the cabin phone. I'm calling the gate supervisor, she announced. This needs settling immediately. As she dialed, Dr. Thompson became aware of movement in economy. Through the curtain, he could see more students boarding, watching with growing concern. Sophia Alvarez had stopped in the aisle. Her dark eyes narrowed as she assessed what was happening. Trevor Williams had quietly slipped his camera from his bag. Victoria spoke urgently into the phone, her back half turned as if to prevent Dr. Thompson from overhearing. Richard stood directly beside seat 2A, one hand resting possessively on the headrest. His message was clear. He had no intention of sitting anywhere else. You're making a spectacle over nothing, he said to Dr. Thompson, voice lowered but sharp. There are plenty of other seats, because it's the one I was assigned. Dr. Thompson replied simply. And because the principle matters. Richard's expression darkened. Principals don't get reports written or deals closed. I need to be rested for my meeting. What's your urgent business? Some academic conference where you'll talk theory with other professors. The dismissal of Dr. Thompson's work was deliberate, establishing a hierarchy that placed Richard's business dealings above scholarly pursuits, particularly when the scholar was black and the businessman white. Victoria returned expression grim but satisfied. The gate supervisor is sending security. Sir, I've tried to be reasonable. The threat was now explicit. Comply or be physically removed, possibly arrested, with all the additional risks that scenario carried for a black man. Dr. Thompson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had faced discrimination before, studied it, written about it, taught students to recognize it. But the stakes here were escalating rapidly. Being removed wouldn't just be humiliating. It would mean missing his keynote address, letting down his students, and creating a potential mark on his record. For a moment, he considered relenting, taking the premium economy seat, filing a complaint later, turning the incident into material for future lectures. It would certainly be easier, safer. Then he looked past Victoria and Richard through the dividing curtain and saw his students' faces. 20 young people who had spent a year studying the dynamics now playing out before them. 20 witnesses to a real-world application of everything he had taught them. What lesson would he be teaching if he backed down? With quiet resolve, Dr. Thompson straightened his shoulders. I'll wait for security to arrive. Perhaps they can help us resolve this situation properly. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't backing down. And as the first of his students began moving purposefully toward the front of the plane, it became clear that he wouldn't be standing alone much longer. Through the dividing curtain, Sophia Alvarez watched with growing indignation. From her position, she could see Dr. Thompson standing in the galley maintaining composure, despite Victoria's dismissive body language and Richard's condescending tone. It was like watching their textbook come to life, the subtle and not so subtle mechanisms of exclusion playing out in real time. A familiar heat rose in her chest, the same righteous anger that had fueled late-night study sessions. She nudged Trevor Williams behind her. Trevor, are you seeing this? Trevor had already sensed the tension. His hand moved automatically to his camera. They're challenging his seat assignment, he observed quietly. They're challenging a lot more than that, Sophia replied, voice tight. They're challenging his right to be there. Trevor's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene more carefully. He recognized the pattern too, had studied it in Dr. Thompson's class, had even filmed interviews with people who had experienced similar treatment. But seeing it happen to their professor, a man whose intellect and dignity they respected deeply, brought the academic concept into stark reality. Behind them, Maya Johnson stopped in the aisle, legal casebook still in hand. What's going on? Sophia kept her voice low but intense. They're trying to move Dr. Thompson out of first class. That white businessman is claiming his seat and the flight attendant is backing him up without checking his ticket. Maya's expression hardened. As a black woman headed for law school, she had a visceral understanding of what Dr. Thompson was experiencing. They can't do that. His ticket was confirmed. I was with him at check-in. Daniel Reyes sensed the cluster forming and made his way forward. Why are we stopping? Trevor turned to him. Dr. Thompson is being profiled. They're trying to move him from his assigned seat in first class. Daniel's brow furrowed. That's ridiculous. The university booked that seat months ago. It makes perfect sense if you've been paying attention in class, Sophia replied sharply. Zoe Chen, typically reserved, pushed forward to join them. It's Chapter 4. From his book Exclusion Through Procedural Enforcement, she said, her voice quiet but clear. They're using protocol as a weapon. James Okafor nodded grimly. I've seen this before. They don't say you don't belong. They say there's a problem with your paperwork. The moment hung between them, a test of whether theories discussed in the classroom would translate into action. In that suspended moment, Sophia flashed back to Dr. Thompson's lecture on gatekeeping. Gatekeeping rarely presents itself as explicit exclusion, he had explained. It masquerades as procedure or policy. The bouncer doesn't say we don't want your kind here. He says there seems to be an issue with your ticket, but only to certain people. A student had asked, how do you challenge that kind of disguised gatekeeping? Dr. Thompson's answer now echoed in Sophia's mind. Name it for what it is. Bring witnesses. Document it. And most importantly, refuse to internalize the message that you don't belong. Now, watching their professor facing this scenario, Sophia felt a decision crystallizing. The academic had become personal. The theoretical had become real. We need to do something, she said, voice suddenly clear and determined. Maya nodded immediately. This is textbook discrimination. Trevor adjusted his camera strap silently, indicating readiness to document. Daniel hesitated, his practical nature asserting itself. What exactly are you suggesting? This is a federal flight. If things escalate, if we don't get involved, Sophia cut in, we're complicit. We've spent a year studying these patterns. We can't just watch it happen. The calculation played across Daniel's face. Personal risk against moral imperative. Individual consequences against collective responsibility. Jessica Martinez spoke up from behind them, voice soft but firm. Dr. Thompson would stand up for any of us. That simple truth shifted the atmosphere. The hesitation dissolved, replaced by resolve. Trevor removed his camera from its bag. I'll document everything. They can't deny video evidence. Maya squared her shoulders. I'll cite the relevant passenger rights regulations. They can't arbitrarily reassign confirmed seats. Sophia took a deep breath. I'm going up there. Now. Daniel placed a hand on her arm. Not alone. We do this together. Zoe Chen, who rarely spoke in group settings, suddenly found her voice. I always thought I'd freeze in situations like this. I guess today, I find out who I really am. The moment of decision had arrived. 20 students armed with education and sense of justice silently agreed to put theory into practice. As they began moving toward the first-class cabin, none of them fully grasped how this choice would transform not just the next few minutes, but the trajectory of their lives, and ultimately, an entire industry's approach to dignity and belonging. Victoria Palmer was explaining to Dr. Thompson, for what seemed like the 5th time, that security was on the way, when a clear, confident voice cut through the tension. Excuse me, that's our professor you're speaking to. Sophia Alvarez stood at the boundary between cabins, her posture straight, eyes focused and unwavering. She wasn't just crossing a physical line, but a social one, challenging the invisible wall between those who question and those who get questioned. Victoria turned visibly startled. Her professional mask slipped, revealing annoyance. This doesn't concern you. Return to your seat. We're handling a seating issue. When you discriminate against our mentor, it absolutely concerns us. Sophia replied, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby passengers. The word discriminate hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Dr. Thompson looked at his student with surprise and pride. He had taught Sophia to identify systemic barriers, to name them clearly, but never expected she would apply those lessons on his behalf. Victoria's face flushed. That is completely inappropriate. I am following procedure for a duplicate seating assignment. Are you? Daniel stepped up beside Sophia. His business casual attire and confident bearing making him look older than his 23 years. Because from what we observed, you verified our professor's boarding pass, failed to find him on an outdated manifest, then immediately accepted another passenger's claim without checking his ticket at all. Victoria's eyes widened. Richard Whitfield stepped forward, face reddening. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is between the airline and passengers in first class. We all saw his boarding pass." Daniel continued undeterred. "It clearly shows seat 2A. We were with him when he checked in." The university confirmed his seat twice. Other passengers were now openly watching. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed interested in how this would play out. A few had taken out phones. Whether to avoid eye contact or record the incident wasn't clear. "Go back to your seats," a heavy-set man in row 3 called out. "Some of us paid good money not to deal with this nonsense." Victoria attempted to regain control. "I understand you're concerned about your professor, but you need to return to your seats. You're blocking the aisle and delaying departure. We'll return to our seats when Dr. Thompson is in his," Sophia stated firmly. Richard Whitfield's face darkened further. "Can't you control your students?" he asked Dr. Thompson, as if their advocacy somehow reflected a failure of authority. "My students are adults capable of making their own ethical judgments," Dr. Thompson replied calmly. "I don't control them. I educate them." Trevor Williams had positioned himself behind Sophia and Daniel camera, now raised to eye level, the small red recording light clearly visible. Victoria noticed immediately. "You can't film on this aircraft. It's against company policy." "Actually," Trevor replied, "Transatlantic's policy states passengers may record personal travel experiences as long as they don't interfere with crew duties or compromise safety. I checked before boarding." His voice carried quiet confidence. "I'm documenting my personal experience of watching my professor face discriminatory treatment." The word discriminatory reinforced Sophia's earlier accusation, making it impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding. More students gathered behind the first 3, creating a growing presence at the cabin boundary. Maya Johnson stepped forward holding her legal casebook. Under DOT regulations, once a boarding pass is issued and scanned, the airline cannot arbitrarily reassign that seat without passenger consent or operational necessity, she stated precisely. Passenger preference, even a frequent flyer's, does not constitute operational necessity. Victoria looked increasingly flustered as articulate, informed students joined the confrontation. The simple power dynamic she had established, one flight attendant against one passenger, was rapidly shifting. James Okafor, normally reserved, spoke up. "I've witnessed this pattern in multiple countries. The only common denominator is who's being questioned and who isn't." Zoe Chen, finding strength in the moment, added, "We're literally watching Chapter 4 of Dr. Thompson's book play out in real time." Richard scoffed loudly. "This is absurd. I'm not going to stand here arguing with college kids about airline policies they don't understand." "We understand exactly what's happening," Sir Sophia replied without flinching. "We've spent a year studying precisely these dynamics in Dr. Thompson's class. We recognize gatekeeping when we see it." The blunt assessment hung in the air. Several first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably. One woman near the window removed her reading glasses, her attention fully engaged. "I appreciate your concern for your professor," Victoria said, trying a different approach, "but you're misinterpreting a simple procedural issue. For the final time, please return to your seats before I'm forced to call security." "We'll be happy to explain to security exactly what we've witnessed," Maya replied calmly. "And I'm sure they'll be interested in reviewing Trevor's footage." A businessman in row 4 who had been watching silently suddenly spoke up. "For what it's worth, I think the students have a point. I saw Dr. Thompson's boarding pass. It clearly showed 2A. Victoria's head snapped toward him, betrayal written across her face. One of her own passengers was breaking ranks. The confrontation had reached a critical point. Victoria stood at the center of a situation rapidly spiraling beyond her control. Richard's entitlement was being challenged openly, and Dr. Thompson watched as his students transformed abstract classroom discussions into real-world advocacy. The private indignity Victoria had attempted to impose on Dr. Thompson had transformed into a public reckoning. And somewhere in the back of the plane, a passenger had already sent the first tweet about what was unfolding on Flight 237. What began with Sophia, Daniel, and Trevor quickly transformed into something more powerful. As if responding to an unspoken signal, the remaining students moved forward, forming a unified presence around the aisle. Jessica Martinez stepped up beside Maya, her quiet demeanor belied by determination in her eyes. Marcus Lee joined them, his tall frame adding physical presence. Emma Wilson, with her blonde hair and preppy attire, stood with them, her appearance a stark contrast to Victoria's assumptions about who might challenge authority. One by one, students emerged from economy, each face reflecting the same resolve, until all 20 formed a human chain stretching from the galley back into the main cabin. They didn't shout. They didn't push. They simply stood a silent wall of solidarity that could not be ignored or dismissed. The visual impact was undeniable. These students represented America itself. Different races, backgrounds, and perspectives united by commitment to justice. Their diversity made their unity all the more powerful, a living refutation of the divisions Victoria and Richard seemed intent on enforcing. "This is completely inappropriate," Richard sputtered, surveying the growing assembly. "You can't just mob the first-class cabin. We're not a mob, Mr. Whitfield," Sophia replied calmly. "We're witnesses to discrimination. There's a significant difference." Trevor continued filming, capturing Victoria's increasingly flustered expressions. Richard's indignation, and most importantly, the dignified calm with which Dr. Thompson stood his ground. The contrast was stark, one man maintaining composure, while those challenging his belonging grew increasingly agitated. Other passengers began taking sides, though mostly through whispers and glances, rather than open intervention. A businessman in seat 3C removed his earbuds, watching with interest. An elderly couple exchanged concerned looks, the woman's hand moving to rest on her husband's arm. "They think they can change the rules just by making a scene," a man in a golf shirt complained loudly. "Maybe the rules need changing," responded a woman across the aisle. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What Victoria had intended as a quiet removal, the kind that happened countless times without comment, had become a public referendum on dignity and belonging. Dr. Thompson felt complex emotions rising as he watched his students form their protective formation. There was pride in their courage and articulation, but there was also concern about potential consequences, especially for his students of color. "Sophia," he said quietly, "I appreciate what you're all doing, but I don't want anyone risking their academic standing." Sophia's expression didn't waver. "With respect, Professor, this is exactly what you taught us, to recognize systemic inequity and challenge it directly. We're applying the curriculum." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the student group. Maya stepped forward. "In your first lecture, you said education that doesn't translate to action is merely performance. We're not performing, Dr. Thompson. We're practicing." The echo of his own teachings reflected back to him was profoundly moving. These weren't students parroting phrases. They were embodying principles, giving intellectual concepts life through their actions. A timid voice from the middle of the student group suddenly spoke up. It was Zoe Chen, typically the quietest student in class. "My whole life I've stayed silent when I've seen things like this," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Not today. This delay affects everyone," Victoria announced loudly, attempting to turn passengers against the students. "We can't take off until everyone is seated. Then resolve it correctly." Daniel responded immediately. "Dr. Thompson has a valid boarding pass for seat 2A. Honor it, and we'll all return to our seats." The solution's simplicity hung in the air, a direct challenge to Victoria's complicated justifications. The message was clear: this isn't complex. This is about choosing whether to do the right thing. "I am not giving up my seat," Richard declared loudly. "I'm a Platinum Elite member with over 1 million miles. I have earned certain privileges. Privileges aren't rights, Mr. Whitfield." Dr. Thompson said, breaking his silence. His voice carried natural authority from decades in lecture halls. My students understand that distinction well. Perhaps that's a conversation worth having once we're airborne with me in 2A and you in another first-class seat. As their standoff continued, the domino effect of delay rippled through the aircraft. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. Cabin crew, what's the status? We are now 20 minutes behind schedule. Victoria reached for the cabin phone movements, stiff with tension. The united front of students remained unmoved, their presence a physical manifestation of the principle at stake. Trevor Williams continued recording his camera, capturing what would soon become evidence in a case study on power resistance and the courage to stand up for dignity. Trevor Williams had begun filming with instinctive timing. His camera captured not just the confrontation itself, but telling details, revealing underlying dynamics. Victoria's dismissive glances when she thought no one was looking. Richard's entitled posture as he stood possessively beside seat 2A. The contrast between Dr. Thompson's composed dignity and the growing agitation of those challenging his presence. The small red recording light served as both witness and warning, a reminder that this interaction wouldn't vanish into conflicting accounts and plausible deniability. It would be preserved, reviewed, and judged by audiences far beyond Flight 237. Stop filming immediately, Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with panic. Recording crew members without consent violates policy. Trevor lowered the camera slightly, but kept it running. I'm documenting a passenger experience, not specifically filming crew, but I'm happy to focus exclusively on how Dr. Thompson is being treated, if you prefer. The subtle recasting of his actions was deliberate and effective. By framing his recording as documentation of passenger treatment, rather than crew surveillance, he positioned himself on solid legal ground, and Victoria knew it. This is intimidation, Richard declared, gesturing toward the camera. You're trying to pressure the airline into giving special treatment. There's nothing special about expecting a passenger to receive their assigned seat, Maya countered. What's special is how quickly you were given benefit of the doubt, while Dr. Thompson's claim was treated with suspicion. Trevor adjusted his angle, making sure to capture Richard's reaction. The businessman's face flushed darker, his hand tightening around his expensive briefcase. Other passengers had begun taking out their own phones. A woman in row 5 was openly recording. A younger man near the back of first class appeared to be live streaming, narrating quietly to an online audience. Flying while. Black happening right now on my flight, he dictated quietly into his phone. Professor being denied seat, while businessman with same seat number gets immediate respect. 20 students standing up for him. The documentation was expanding beyond Trevor's footage, beyond anyone's control. In the age of social media, what happened in this cabin wouldn't stay in this cabin. Victoria's eyes darted from Trevor's camera to the other phones now pointed in her direction. Her authority, once seemingly absolute within the aircraft, was being challenged not just by the student's presence, but by the prospect of public accountability. Get these people out of my way, Richard demanded, composure cracking. I paid for first class specifically to avoid this kind of disruption. The hesitation before disruption carried unmistakable subtext. Several students exchanged glances, recognizing the coded language they had studied, how certain words became proxies for more explicit prejudice. We'll gladly return to our seats, Mr. Whitfield, Sophia replied evenly. As soon as our professor is seated in 2A, as his boarding pass indicates he should be. Trevor zoomed in on Sophia's face as she spoke, capturing the calm determination in her expression. Then he panned to Dr. Thompson, who stood watching with a complex mixture of pride and concern. A professor witnessing his students apply teachings in real time, worried about potential consequences for their advocacy. The footage was capturing not just a seating dispute, but a profound educational reckoning theory, meeting practice classroom concepts colliding with lived reality. Victoria made one more attempt to stop the recording. Sir, I'm instructing you to put that camera away. If you refuse, you'll be violating crew member instructions, a federal offense. Trevor lowered the camera from his eye, but kept it running at waist level. I believe you're misrepresenting regulations, Ms. Palmer. FAA guidelines and transatlantic's policies permit non-disruptive recording of personal travel experiences. I'm standing still, speaking calmly, and documenting what's happening to a fellow passenger. If you'd like to escalate this legally, I'm happy to continue this conversation with the airline's legal team. The confident citation of policy created enough doubt to make Victoria hesitate. She was caught in an increasingly public standoff without a clear path to reassert control. Richard, frustrated by continued resistance, made a critical mistake. "Get these people out of my way," he said loudly, gesturing dismissively. "I don't care what it takes. I'm not missing my meeting because of some professor and his entourage playing social justice warriors." The dismissive characterization, captured clearly on multiple recordings, revealed the underlying attitude the students had been naming. It wasn't about procedures or manifests. It was about who belonged in first class and who didn't, who deserved deference and who deserved scrutiny. Trevor's camera caught Richard's outburst in perfect clarity. The contemptuous expression, the dismissive gesture, the revealing choice of words. What might have been dismissed as procedural misunderstanding was now undeniably exposed as something far more problematic. Other passengers reacted visibly. A woman in row 4 shook her head in disapproval. The couple in the bulkhead seats exchanged loaded glances. Even a businessman who had seemed aligned with Richard shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less certain about which side he wanted to be associated with. "I've got a meeting to get to as well, sir," called out a black executive in row 7, who had been silent until now. "Funny how my meetings never seem important enough to violate someone else's rights." The comment landed heavily, several passengers nodding in recognition of the double standard being exposed. As recordings continued, Trevor's professional quality video, and the growing number of passenger phones, the nature of the confrontation shifted again. What Victoria had intended as quiet enforcement of unwritten rules had become a documented case study in the dynamics Dr. Thompson had spent his career analyzing. The invisible was being made visible, the implicit rendered explicit, all captured in high definition. In that moment, as Trevor continued his calm documentation, the balance of power underwent another subtle but significant shift. Victoria and Richard were no longer just accountable to immediate authority. They were potentially accountable to a global audience. In that expanded context, their actions would be judged not by unwritten rules that often govern such interactions, but by the stated values their institutions claimed to uphold. The evidence was accumulating frame by frame, and there would be no going back to the comfortable obscurity where everyday indignities typically resided. The standoff had reached its 20th minute when Michael Rodriguez, the head purser, emerged from the rear galley. At 45, he carried himself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed thousands of flights and countless passenger situations. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples. His uniform impeccably pressed his expression, one of professional concern. "Victoria, what's happening here?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent, an unmistakable tone of authority. Victoria turned with visible relief. "Michael, we have a seating issue in first class, and these students are refusing to return to economy. They're blocking the aisle and delaying departure." Michael's eyes took in the situation with a comprehensive glance. Dr. Thompson, standing calmly by the galley. Richard beside seat 2A. The 20 students forming their human chain, Trevor's camera still recording, and various passengers watching or filming. "And what exactly is the seating issue?" Before Victoria could answer, Sophia spoke up. "Our professor, Dr. Thompson, has a valid boarding pass for seat 2A, which was scanned and verified at the gate. Ms. Palmer claims his name isn't on her manifest and is trying to move him to economy to accommodate Mr. Whitfield, whose ticket she hasn't even checked." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. He turned to Victoria. "Is this accurate?" Victoria's cheeks flushed. "There's a duplicate booking for 2A. I checked the manifest and found Mr. Whitfield's name, but not the gentleman's." She gestured vaguely toward Dr. Thompson, still avoiding using his name or title. "Dr. Marcus Thompson," the professor supplied calmly. "Professor of sociology at Westlake University." Michael nodded respectfully. Dr. Thompson, may I see your boarding pass, please? Dr. Thompson handed it over. Michael examined it carefully, noting the seat assignment, the successfully scanned barcode, and the university billing information. And Mr. Whitfield, your boarding pass as well, please. Richard reluctantly produced his own pass from his jacket pocket. Michael examined it with equal care, then looked up with a frown. Both passes indeed show seat 2A, he confirmed. This is unusual. Victoria, did you call the gate to verify the master passenger list when you discovered the duplication? Victoria shifted uncomfortably. I tried, but they were busy with boarding. I used the printed manifest instead. The manifest, printed before departure, often doesn't reflect last-minute changes. Michael explained, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of disappointment. That's why we verify with the gate when there's a discrepancy. He turned to Dr. Thompson. When was your ticket booked, sir? 3 months ago by Westlake University's travel office, Dr. Thompson replied, and confirmed twice, most recently yesterday. Michael nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Richard. And yours, Mr. Whitfield? I'm on this flight every 2 weeks, Richard replied dismissively. I always book 2A. I understand, but when was this specific reservation made? Richard hesitated, then admitted reluctantly, last week. But as I said, I always sit in 2A. The airline knows my preference. Michael's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes. So, Dr. Thompson's booking predates yours by several months. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, one that established chronology at odds with Victoria's immediate deference to Richard's claim. Michael pulled out his tablet and accessed the booking system. According to the master list, Dr. Thompson is indeed assigned to seat 2A. He confirmed after a moment. It appears there was a system error during Mr. Whitfield's booking that should have been caught. Victoria's expression froze somewhere between disbelief and embarrassment. But the manifest is outdated, Michael interrupted firmly. The electronic system shows the correct assignments. The implication was clear. Victoria had relied on incomplete information to make a judgment that just happened to favor the white businessman over the black professor. Whether conscious bias or unconscious assumption, the impact remained the same. Richard was not prepared to concede. This is unacceptable, he declared. I specifically request seat 2A on every flight. Someone made an error and I shouldn't be penalized for it. Michael turned to him with professional courtesy but unmistakable firmness. Mr. Whitfield, I understand your frustration, but booking records clearly show Dr. Thompson was assigned this seat first. We have several excellent alternatives in first class I'd be happy to offer you. I don't want alternatives, Richard insisted. I want the seat I always sit in. The conversation had shifted from procedure to preference, from rules to personal desire. Preference is not the same as assignment, Michael explained calmly. When there's a genuine seating conflict, standard procedure is to honor the earlier booking which belongs to Dr. Thompson. Richard's face flushed with anger. Do you have any idea who I am? I've flown over 1 million miles with this airline. I expect certain accommodations. I understand your status, Mr. Whitfield, and we value your loyalty, Michael replied, never wavering. But I cannot displace another passenger from their legitimately assigned seat based solely on preference, no matter how many miles you've accumulated. The clear application of rules, regardless of status, was exactly what Victoria had failed to provide. Michael's intervention represented not just procedural correction, but a fundamental shift in framing. No longer was Dr. Thompson's presence in first class being treated as questionable. It was being recognized as legitimate and protected. Victoria attempted to save face. I was only following protocol for disputed seating. The protocol, Michael corrected her gently, is to verify the electronic master list, not rely on a printed manifest, and certainly not to make assumptions about which passenger's claim is more valid without proper verification. The rebuke, though diplomatically delivered, was unmistakable. Victoria fell silent. Sophia exchanged glances with fellow students. Cautious optimism replacing defensive solidarity. Trevor continued filming, capturing this shift in momentum as Michael applied rules fairly and transparently. Dr. Thompson spoke up. Thank you for clarifying the situation, Mr. Rodriguez. I appreciate your professionalism. Michael nodded respectfully. I apologize for the confusion and any distress it caused Dr. Thompson. We aim to provide all passengers with respect and courtesy. He turned to the students. I understand why you felt it necessary to advocate for your professor. However, I must ask you to return to your seats so we can prepare for departure. Sophia looked to Dr. Thompson, who gave a slight nod. We'll return to our seats once Dr. Thompson is seated in 2A, she said, maintaining their core condition. Michael turned to Richard. Mr. Whitfield, I can offer you seat 3F, also a window seat in first class. As a gesture of goodwill, we'll provide complimentary premium beverage service and 10,000 bonus miles for the inconvenience. The offer was generous, allowing Richard to save face while still acknowledging Dr. Thompson's rightful claim. For a moment, it seemed a resolution was within reach, a way to de-escalate and allow the flight to proceed. But Richard Whitfield wasn't finished. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again. Tension evident through the static cabin crew. We are now 30 minutes behind schedule. What is the status? We've missed our departure window and need rescheduling by air traffic control. The pressure was building not just for the crew and passengers, but for the complex choreography of departures and arrivals at JFK. Each minute rippled outward, affecting connecting flights, crew schedules, and the airline's performance metrics. Michael felt that pressure acutely as he turned back to Richard. Sir, we need to resolve this quickly. The captain is waiting for cabin confirmation to request a new departure slot. Richard stood his ground, expression hardening. I've made myself clear. I sit in 2A. That's non-negotiable. Mr. Whitfield. Michael said, patience strained but intact. I've explained the situation. Dr. Thompson has been assigned seat 2A. I'm offering an excellent alternative in 3F with compensation. This is the most equitable solution available. Equitable. Richard scoffed. There's nothing equitable about bumping a platinum elite member who flies twice monthly for someone who probably flies once a year. The dismissive characterization hung in the air, its subtext clear to everyone listening. Trevor's camera captured the moment perfectly. Richard's sense of entitlement laid bare. Flight frequency in his worldview determined rights. Status conferred not just perks, but fundamental claims to space and deference. My frequency of travel is irrelevant to my ticket's validity, Dr. Thompson replied calmly. I understand your preference, but preference isn't right. Continuing to insist otherwise only delays the flight for everyone. The reasonableness of Dr. Thompson's position contrasted sharply with Richard's inflexible demands. Other passengers had begun shifting from curious observation to visible frustration, their own connections and schedules now threatened. Michael made one final attempt. Mr. Whitfield, I need your decision. Will you accept seat 3F and the compensation offered, or do we need to escalate further? I should warn you that further delay may require contacting ground operations. Richard's face flushed darker. This is outrageous. I want to speak to the captain, now. The captain is preparing for departure and cannot leave the cockpit, Michael explained. I'm the senior cabin crew member authorized to resolve passenger issues. Then call someone who can override you, Richard demanded. Because I am not moving. The impasse had reached breaking point. Michael looked torn between protocol and practicality, aware that removing a high-status passenger would create paperwork and potential blowback, but equally aware that continued delay was becoming untenable. At this critical moment, Sophia stepped forward, her voice clear and carrying just enough to be heard throughout first class and the front of economy. Mr. Rodriguez, we understand the difficult position you're in, she began, respectful but resolute. So let me make this very clear. Either Dr. Thompson takes his assigned seat 2A right now, or we all deplane, all 21 of us. The ultimatum hung in the air, its implications immediately apparent. 21 passengers deplaning would require unloading all checked baggage, a process adding at least an hour to the delay. It would also require extensive documentation reports to authorities and potentially significant compensation to affected connecting passengers. And to be perfectly clear, Sophia continued, this isn't just a threat. Trevor has been recording this entire interaction. She gestured toward him, still filming steadily. If we deplane, that footage will be sent to every major news outlet in New York before we even reach the terminal. We'll also post it to every social media platform with appropriate hashtags and tag Transatlantic Airways in all of them. Maya stepped forward, her legal training evident in her precise diction. The footage clearly shows Ms. Palmer making assumptions based on appearance rather than verification. Mr. Whitfield receiving preferential treatment without proper ticket checks, and a systematic attempt to displace a passenger from his confirmed seat without valid cause. Trevor added, "I've already saved backup copies to cloud storage. The footage can't be deleted or confiscated." Zoe Chen, finding courage in the collective stand, added, "I've already started a Twitter thread. Seat justice and flying while black are gaining traction, while black are gaining." The leverage they wielded wasn't just logistical, but reputational. In an age where consumer experiences could go viral within hours, the students were offering a choice between a difficult but contained situation or a public relations crisis that could cost the airline millions in negative publicity and lost bookings. Michael Rodriguez recognized immediately the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about one seat anymore. It was about how transatlantic would be perceived if footage emerged, showing a distinguished black professor being removed from his rightful seat to accommodate a white businessman, especially after the airline's recent diversity campaign and public commitments to inclusion. Richard seemed oblivious to these larger implications, focused entirely on his thwarted expectation. "This is blackmail," he declared. "You can't threaten the airline like this." "It's not a threat, Mr. Whitfield," Daniel replied calmly. "It's a natural consequence. If Dr. Thompson is denied his legitimate seat, we will exercise our right to deplane and share our experience. That's not blackmail. It's accountability." Other passengers had begun murmuring, some expressing support for the students, others simply anxious about further delays. The pressure on Michael had intensified exponentially. He looked from Richard's obstinate expression to Dr. Thompson's dignified composure, to the united front of students with their leverage of documentation and publicity. The calculations were clear. 21 passengers deplaning would cause major operational problems. The footage going public could damage the airline's reputation and potentially trigger investigations. Allowing Richard to prevail would set a troubling precedent about who the airline valued. Against these considerations, the alternative seemed increasingly logical. Enforce correct seat assignments, manage Richard's disappointment, and get the flight airborne. Michael made his decision. "Mr. Whitfield, I understand your frustration, but I must insist you take seat 3F, or an alternative first-class seat. Dr. Thompson will be seated in 2A, as his ticket indicates. This is not negotiable." The firmness signaled the fundamental shift. Richard was no longer being accommodated or placated. He was being instructed with the airline's full authority, finally aligned with Dr. Thompson's legitimate rights. Richard looked around, seeking support or sympathy, but found none. First class had become a very public arena, with his behavior on display and being judged not just by those immediately present, but potentially by a much larger audience. "This is the last time I fly with this airline," he declared, voice thick with indignation. "You've lost a loyal customer today." "That's your choice, Mr. Whitfield," Michael replied professionally. "Now, will you be taking seat 3F, or would you prefer a different available first-class seat?" The question was pointed, leaving no room for further argument about seat 2A. Richard's options had narrowed to simple choice: comply or leave the aircraft. His leverage of status and frequency, so often sufficient to bend rules, had finally met its limit. Dr. Thompson spoke up, extending an unexpected olive branch. "Mr. Whitfield, once we're airborne, I'd be happy to discuss the dynamics we've experienced today. As a professor of sociology, specializing in structural inequality, I find this interaction quite illuminating. Perhaps we both might learn something from it." The offer, extended with genuine intellectual interest rather than sarcasm, seemed to catch Richard off guard. For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of self-awareness, or simply recognition that his position had become untenable. "Fine," he said finally. The single word weighted with reluctance. 3F will do. The collective relief was palpable. Victoria, who had been standing silently since Michael's intervention, moved quickly to assist Richard with his belongings, perhaps hoping to salvage some professional dignity. Sophia looked to Dr. Thompson, who gave her a slight nod of appreciation. The students began to disperse, returning to economy with quiet satisfaction of having successfully applied theories to real-world situation. Trevor lowered his camera, but didn't turn it off completely. A subtle indication that accountability remained in place until Dr. Thompson was actually seated. Michael turned to Dr. Thompson. "Dr. Thompson, I apologize again for this confusion and how it was handled. Please take your seat, and I'll arrange complimentary beverage service for you as well." As Dr. Thompson moved towards seat 2A, the seat that had become a symbolic fulcrum in this confrontation of principle versus privilege. The cabin began settling into normal pre-departure rhythms. But everyone present knew what had transpired was far from normal, and its repercussions would extend far beyond this flight. The passenger in seat 1A had observed the entire confrontation with careful attention. Elise Harrington, Transatlantic Airways' Chief Customer Experience Officer, had been traveling incognito, a practice she employed regularly to assess service quality without the artificial performance that accompanied official visits. At 52, with silver-streaked dark hair in a simple chignon and minimal jewelry, she could easily pass for just another business traveler rather than an executive who oversaw the experience of millions of passengers annually. She had watched Victoria's initial interaction with Dr. Thompson, noted the immediate suspicion, observed how quickly Richard's claim was accepted without verification. She had registered Michael's more professional handling of the situation and the powerful advocacy of the 20 students. Most importantly, she had witnessed how close the airline had come to a public relations disaster. As Dr. Thompson prepared to take his seat and the cabin began returning to normal, Elise made a decision. She closed her laptop with a decisive click and rose from her seat. The effect was immediate. Victoria's eyes widened in recognition, her posture stiffening automatically. Michael turned surprise evident in his expression, followed by something close to dread. Even other flight attendants froze momentarily as they registered her presence. "Ms. Harrington," Michael said, quickly recovering. "I wasn't aware you were aboard. We've had a seating issue, but it's resolved now." Elise stepped into the aisle, her presence commanding attention without effort. "I've observed the entire situation, Michael. Thank you for your eventual intervention, but I believe we have matters to address before takeoff." Victoria had gone pale, suddenly realizing her handling of Dr. Thompson had been witnessed not by some random passenger, but by the executive responsible for setting and maintaining customer service standards. Elise turned first to Dr. Thompson, extending her hand. "Dr. Thompson, I'm Elise Harrington, Chief Customer Experience Officer for Transatlantic. On behalf of our airline, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you've received today. It falls far short of our standards and values." Dr. Thompson shook her hand, expression reflecting surprise at this unexpected turn. "Thank you, Ms. Harrington. I appreciate the acknowledgement." "It's more than acknowledgement," Elise replied, her voice carrying clearly. "It's an admission of failure. What happened here today represents exactly the kind of experience we're committed to eliminating." She turned to face Victoria, professional demeanor masking, but not hiding disapproval. "Victoria, I observed your handling of this situation from the beginning. You questioned Dr. Thompson's valid boarding pass, failed to verify the electronic manifest, accepted Mr. Whitfield's claim without checking his ticket, and attempted to relocate Dr. Thompson based on assumptions rather than facts. These actions violated our protocols and commitment to treating all passengers with equal respect." Victoria's face had drained of color. "Ms. Harrington, I was only trying to resolve a seating. Please don't mischaracterize what I witnessed directly," Elise interrupted firmly. "This was not a procedural error. It was a failure of judgment and breach of our most fundamental service principles. She addressed the cabin at large, aware that every passenger was listening intently. At Transatlantic Airways, we state publicly that every passenger deserves equal treatment, regardless of appearance, background, or frequency of travel. Today, we failed to live up to that promise. The public acknowledgement of failure delivered by a senior executive created stunned silence. This wasn't damage control or corporate spin. It was direct accountability. Elise continued, "To begin addressing this failure immediately, there will be a change in our cabin crew." She turned back to Victoria. "Victoria, please collect your personal items and deplane. We will operate this flight without you." The directive was delivered without anger, but with unmistakable finality. Victoria stood frozen, unable to process the consequence being imposed in real time in front of the very passengers who had witnessed her behavior. "Ms. Harrington," she finally managed, "I've been with Transatlantic for 15 years, and in those 15 years, you should have learned our core service principles." Elise replied, "We will discuss your status with the airline after appropriate review. For now, please deplane so we can prepare for departure." The decision was swift, public, and proportionate, a clear signal, not just to Victoria, but to everyone witnessing that the airline was taking the incident seriously. Michael stepped forward to escort Victoria to the galley, where she could collect her belongings away from passengers' view, her professional composure finally crumbling as reality sank in. Elise then turned to Richard Whitfield, who had been watching this executive intervention with growing discomfort. "Mr. Whitfield, we value your loyalty as a frequent flyer. However, loyalty must be mutual. Just as you expect respect from our airline, we expect respect for all our passengers and adherence to our protocols. I understand you've accepted seat 3F. As a gesture of goodwill, we'll add 25,000 miles to your account for the inconvenience." The offer was simultaneously generous and firm, acknowledging his status, while establishing boundaries around how that status could be leveraged. Richard nodded stiffly, perhaps recognizing that further protest would be futile, with an executive of Elise's standing personally involved. Finally, Elise turned to the students, who had been watching from economy, with mixture of surprise and vindication. "To all of you," she said, her voice carrying to where they stood, "your advocacy for your professor was principled and effective. You identified a genuine injustice and addressed it directly but respectfully. While we never want our passengers to feel they must stand up against unfair treatment on our airline, the fact that you did so speaks to both your character and the quality of education you're receiving." The acknowledgement was unexpected, a corporate executive validating rather than minimizing their concerns. Several students exchanged glances, Sophia's expression reflecting surprise that their intervention had been recognized as legitimate rather than dismissed as disruptive. "Now," Elise continued, addressing the cabin at large, "I believe we've delayed this flight long enough. Dr. Thompson, please take your seat. Everyone else, please prepare for departure. The captain will be requesting a new departure slot, and we hope to have you airborne shortly." As the cabin returned to pre-departure preparation, Elise approached Dr. Thompson privately before he took his seat. "Dr. Thompson, once we're at cruising altitude, I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time. I believe Transatlantic Airways could benefit from your expertise in addressing systemic issues this incident has highlighted." Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be happy to discuss it, Ms. Harrington." With that final exchange, Elise returned to her seat. Dr. Thompson settled into 2A, and Richard Whitfield reluctantly took his place in 3F. The students returned to economy, Trevor finally turning off his camera as the cabin crew began the safety demonstration. Flight 237 was finally preparing for departure 45 minutes behind schedule, but having experienced something far more significant than a mere delay. What had begun as routine gatekeeping had transformed into a powerful demonstration of collective action, corporate accountability, and practical application of sociological principles at 35,000 feet. And as the aircraft finally lifted off the runway, banking gently toward the Atlantic, no one aboard fully realized that the ripple effects of what had transpired were just beginning to spread, moving outward through social media, corporate offices, and university classrooms in ways that would eventually transform far more than one flight or one airline. As Flight 237 climbed steadily through clouds above New York, a subtle recalibration was taking place throughout the cabin. First class. So recently the stage for confrontation had settled into uneasy calm. Dr. Thompson sat in seat 2A, gazing out at the receding coastline, his reflection overlaying the view, a man contemplating the layers of what had transpired. "Can I get you anything?" Dr. Thompson asked Alicia, the replacement flight attendant, who had been hastily summoned from the standby crew. "Just water for now, thank you," he replied with a warm smile that acknowledged her professionalism. Across the aisle, Richard Whitfield made a show of dissatisfaction, aggressively pressing the call button twice when his pre-departure champagne was slow to arrive, pointedly rearranging his amenity kit as if finding it inadequate. But beneath his performance of entitlement uncertainty was visible the discomfort of someone whose assumptions about place in the world had been publicly challenged. In seat 1A, Elise Harrington had reopened her laptop, but instead of returning to quarterly reports, she was typing rapidly an email to the airline's training department with subject line, Urgent Service Standards Review and Cultural Competency Initiative. Her fingers moved with purpose, the morning's events already being transformed into institutional change. Back in economy, the 20 students had dispersed to assigned seats, but energy still connected them. They exchanged glances across aisles, subtle nods of accomplishment, text messages between those seated far apart. They had witnessed theory becoming practice, had participated in application of concepts previously confined to lectures and textbooks. Sophia sat beside Trevor, who reviewed footage on his camera's display, both speaking in low voices about key moments. Maya had opened her legal casebook, but wasn't reading it, her mind processing implications of what had occurred. Daniel was making notes on his phone, already thinking about incorporating this experience into his conference presentation. Zoe Chen sat quietly staring out the window with a small smile playing at her lips. She had found her voice today, in a way she never had in the classroom. James Okafor was sketching in his notebook, an impromptu diagram of power dynamics they had just witnessed, complete with annotations. About 30 minutes into the flight, as the seatbelt sign dinged off and cabin service began, something unexpected happened. A middle-aged woman rose from her economy seat and made her way forward to where Dr. Thompson sat. She paused beside him, waiting for him to look up from the book he'd opened. "Excuse me, Dr. Thompson," she said, voice carrying slight tremor. "I witnessed everything before takeoff, and I want to apologize for not speaking up. What you experienced was wrong, and your students were remarkable in how they stood by you." Dr. Thompson regarded her thoughtfully. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Recognizing injustice is the first step. Speaking up is the next. Perhaps next time, you'll feel empowered to do both." It wasn't admonishment, but invitation, gentle nudging toward greater courage. The woman nodded, seeming to take his words seriously before returning to her seat. One by one, other passengers began making similar approaches, brief moments of connection and acknowledgement. An elderly man stopped to shake Dr. Thompson's hand silently. A young professional slipped him a business card with notes scrawled on back. "My company needs speakers on equity. Please contact me." These gestures of solidarity coming after conflict had been resolved carried their own meaning. They represented quiet reckoning of those who had witnessed injustice without intervening, who now felt compelled to acknowledge both their silence and respect for those who had spoken. In economy, similar interactions took place with students. A flight attendant discreetly thanked Sophia for her courage. A businessman asked Trevor about his camera work and whether footage would be made public. Two young children offered students cookies from their snack packs, sensing they had done something important. As night settled over the Atlantic and most passengers drifted to sleep, Dr. Thompson remained awake, the weight of the day's events still processing through his analytical mind. What struck him most wasn't the discrimination itself that was sadly familiar, but the way his students had transformed from theoretical observers to active participants in dismantling it. In the dim cabin, illuminated only by scattered reading lights, he opened his notebook and began to write. The experience was too significant, too multi-layered to process fully on the flight, but he needed to capture key observations while they were fresh. This wouldn't just become material for future lectures. It had fundamentally shifted his understanding of how classroom knowledge translated to real-world action. Several rows back in the darkened economy cabin, Zoe Chen was also awake, typing furiously on her phone. The typically silent student had found her voice not just in the confrontation, but in its aftermath, live tweeting their experience with unexpected eloquence. Today, I learned what courage looks like. It's not fearlessness. It's feeling the fear and standing anyway. Seat justice. # flying. While black, her thread was gaining traction, accumulating thousands of likes and shares as Americans awoke to the unfolding story. Within the sealed metal tube flying over the Atlantic, none of them yet realized how their actions were already rippling outward, creating waves that would soon reach shores far beyond their destination. About an hour into the flight, Michael Rodriguez approached Dr. Thompson. "Ms. Harrington would like to speak with you if you're available." She suggested using the crew rest area for privacy. Dr. Thompson marked his place and nodded. Of course. As he followed Michael toward the front, he passed Richard Whitfield, who stared determinedly at his laptop, refusing to acknowledge Dr. Thompson's presence. The contrast between their behaviors, Dr. Thompson's gracious engagement versus Richard's bitter withdrawal, served as commentary on character. The crew rest area was a small private space, normally reserved for flight attendants on long-haul routes. Elise had transformed it into impromptu meeting room with her tablet displaying notes and a small recorder on the narrow table. "Thank you for joining me," she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. "With your permission, I'd like to record our conversation. What happened today represents a significant failure on our airline's part, and I want to ensure your insights are captured accurately as we address underlying issues." Dr. Thompson settled into the seat. "I'm happy to share my perspective, and I appreciate your direct acknowledgement of what occurred." Elise nodded, activating the recorder. "Let me start by saying again how deeply sorry I am for your experience. Victoria Palmer's actions were wrong on multiple levels, procedurally, ethically, and in terms of basic human dignity. Her actions reflected biases that have no place in our organization." "I appreciate that," Dr. Thompson replied. "Though I would suggest this isn't about one flight attendant or one incident. What happened today is manifestation of broader structural patterns." Elise leaned forward slightly. "That's exactly what I hope to understand. As a sociologist specializing in structural inequality, what would you identify as key systemic failures that enabled this situation?" It was genuine question, not damage control, but authentic seeking of expertise. Dr. Thompson recognized it as such and responded with thoughtful analysis he would offer in professional consultation. The primary failure wasn't in explicit policies, he explained, but implicit ones. The unwritten rules about who receives benefit of doubt, whose presence is questioned, whose claims are automatically believed. Victoria didn't create these patterns. She enacted them perhaps without realizing she was doing so. Elise nodded, making notes. "You're describing unconscious bias manifesting in customer service decisions." "Precisely. But addressing it requires more than telling employees not to discriminate. It requires restructuring decision processes to eliminate opportunities for bias to influence outcomes." Their conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, evolving from specific incident to broader analysis of how corporations could systematically address embedded inequities. Dr. Thompson spoke with clarity honed through decades of research and teaching, while Elise listened with focused attention of an executive genuinely committed to institutional change. As they concluded, Elise asked final question. "Would you be willing to consult with Transatlantic as we develop new training protocols and service standards? Your expertise would be invaluable in ensuring we address root causes, rather than symptoms. Dr. Thompson considered the offer thoughtfully. "I would be open to that conversation, though I would want to ensure any changes were substantive, not merely cosmetic. I wouldn't want it any other way," Elise replied with conviction. As Dr. Thompson returned to his seat, the aircraft cruised steadily eastward over the Atlantic. The initial turbulence of confrontation had given way to smoother air of resolution and reflection. But beneath this temporary calm, powerful currents were already in motion, currents that would eventually reshape not just one flight experience, but broader landscape of travel dignity and belonging. And as night fell over ocean, Trevor Williams carefully transferred his video files to his laptop, creating multiple backups. The footage was more than documentation now. It was evidence, testimony, and potentially catalyst for change that none of them could yet fully imagine. 7 hours into the transatlantic crossing, as most passengers dozed beneath thin airline blankets, digital ripples of what had transpired were beginning to spread across continents. The aircraft's satellite Wi-Fi, though sluggish, had provided just enough bandwidth for Trevor Williams to upload a carefully edited 3-minute version of his footage to multiple platforms. Seated beside Sophia in row 24, Trevor had spent the flight's first hours meticulously selecting key moments. Victoria's dismissive scrutiny of Dr. Thompson's boarding pass, Richard's immediate acceptance without verification, the student's direct challenge, and finally, Elise's intervention and accountability measures. "It needs context," Sophia had advised, leaning close to see his laptop screen. "People who weren't there won't understand the pattern." Trevor nodded, adding simple text overlays that framed the incident without embellishment. Professor of Sociology, Dr. Marcus Thompson, denied his assigned first-class seat on transatlantic Flight 237. When he calmly presented valid boarding pass, flight attendant threatened to have him removed when he questioned this treatment. 20 students refused to sit down until he was treated with respect. #dignity. In flight. Flying. While black. The captions were factual, not inflammatory, allowing footage itself to convey emotional weight. When the edit was complete, Sophia reviewed it with critical eye. "Perfect," she said finally. "It shows exactly what happened without sensationalizing." With sluggish Wi-Fi straining under upload, Trevor hit publish on 3 platforms, simultaneously tagging airline with deliberate choice. This wasn't about public shaming, but institutional accountability. What neither Trevor nor Sophia anticipated was the speed with which documentation would ignite global attention. The video landed not like pebble in pond, but like meteor sending shockwaves through social media feeds, news cycles, and corporate boardrooms. On Trevor's phone, the view counter spun upward with dizzying speed. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, each refresh showing another surge. A heat map visualization showed the video spreading like wildfire. First New York, then Chicago, Los Angeles, London, Tokyo, creating a red wave of engagement circling the globe faster than their plane could cross the Atlantic. By the time Flight 237 reached halfway point, over Atlantic footage had been viewed over 500,000 times. An hour later, it crossed million-view threshold. Comment sections filled with outraged support and personal accounts from others who had experienced similar treatment. This is what we mean when we talk about everyday indignities, wrote a prominent black actor with 15 million followers. Watch how protocol becomes weapon in real time. And watch how solidarity changes everything. #stand with Dr. Thompson. Clear case of disparate treatment, tweeted a well-known civil rights attorney. One passenger's claim accepted without verification, another's questioned despite documentation. The only difference? You can see it. News organizations scrambled to incorporate rapidly spreading footage. CNN's breaking banner read, "Viral video. Black professor denied first-class seat students stage protest." The BBC's more measured headline stated, "University students united stand against airline discrimination, captures global attention." But alongside the overwhelming support came the inevitable backlash. Right-wing commentators were already framing the incident differently. Entitled Professor and Student Mob. Hold entire flight hostage over seating confusion. What happened to civility? Posted a conservative pundit with millions of followers. Professor plays race card when airline follows standard procedure. Is this what they're teaching in universities now? Questioned another. These competing narratives created passionate online debates with Team Thompson and #respect the rules hashtags battling for dominance across platforms. On the flight itself, passengers with Wi-Fi access began realizing they were part of unfolding news story. Some discreetly took selfies with Dr. Thompson, or students visible in background posting with supportive messages. Others reached out to relatives sharing first-hand accounts that added texture to viral footage. I witnessed the whole thing. The professor was completely dignified while being treated terribly. Those students were heroes. Proud to be on this flight, posted a passenger from row 16 at Transatlantic Airways corporate headquarters in Atlanta overnight. Social media team triggered crisis protocol within minutes of video's appearance online. Rapid acceleration of views, shares, and media inquiries pushed incident from potential concern to active crisis in tracking system. The airline's first statement, posted at 2:17 a.m. Eastern Time, was cautious. Transatlantic Airways is aware of an incident on Flight 237 regarding seating assignment. We take all customer concerns seriously and are reviewing the matter. We are in direct contact with passenger involved and will provide further updates. The statement was immediately criticized as inadequate generic corporate response to specific documented discrimination. Comments flooded in. Incident. We all saw what happened. Call it what it is. Customer concerns. He had a valid ticket. This isn't a concern, it's discrimination. Reviewing the matter. The review should take 3 minutes, the length of the video showing exactly what happened. Recognizing escalating situation. CEO James Harrison was awakened with urgent briefing. After viewing footage, he made 2 immediate decisions. First, to fly to Paris personally to meet Dr. Thompson upon flight's arrival. Second, to authorize more substantive public statement, acknowledging gravity of what had occurred. The airline's second statement, released at 4:45 a.m., struck markedly different tone. The treatment experienced by Dr. Marcus Thompson on Flight 237 was unacceptable and does not reflect Transatlantic's values. We have directly apologized to Dr. Thompson and are grateful for intervention of our Chief Customer Experience Officer, who was coincidentally aboard. The crew member involved has been removed from service pending investigation. We are reviewing all training and protocols to ensure such incidents never recur. Transatlantic is committed to environment where all passengers are treated with equal dignity and respect. This acknowledgement of specific failure, rather than generic concern, was better received, though many noted it had taken massive public pressure to elicit genuine response. Meanwhile, at Whitfield Financial Group headquarters, an early morning emergency notification had gone out to the crisis management team. Their CFO was being identified across social media platforms as the entitled businessman in the rapidly spreading video. The company's mentions were exploding with negative comments, and journalists were already reaching out for statements. As video continued spreading through time zones like digital sunrise, it transcended mere viral content to become cultural touchpoint. Clear, undeniable documentation of subtle and not so subtle ways bias manifests in everyday interactions. It was being shared in university classrooms, corporate training sessions, and family group chats, sparking difficult conversations and uncomfortable recognitions. For many viewers, most powerful aspect wasn't discrimination itself, sadly familiar to millions, but unified response of students. Their collective action refusal to be passive witnesses resonated across generational and demographic lines. Those students give me hope for the future. They didn't just talk about justice. They stood up for it. This is what allyship looks like: specific, strategic, and willing to use privilege to challenge injustice. I cried watching this, not because of what happened to the professor, but because his students refused to let it happen without consequence. The hashtag #Stand for Dignity began trending globally, inspiring others to share their own stories of confronting discrimination or pledging to speak up in future. Meanwhile, as Flight 237 continued eastward through night, most key participants remained unaware of their growing status as symbols in global conversation about dignity, belonging, and courage to stand against injustice. Dr. Thompson slept peacefully in seat 2A. Students dozed in economy, and Trevor's laptop continued automatically backing up footage that was already transforming landscape they would land in when morning came. Digital ripples had become waves, and by time sun rose over European continent, those waves would reach shores of corporate boardrooms, university administrations, and regulatory agencies with force that would demand more than statements. It would demand fundamental change. 3 months after events aboard Flight 237, significant gathering took place in Transatlantic Airways' newly renovated training center outside Atlanta. Large auditorium typically used for new hire orientations was filled with unusual mix of attendees, airline executives in business attire, flight attendants in uniform civil rights attorneys, travel industry regulators, and contingent of university students, including familiar faces from Westlake. On stage, beneath backdrop displaying the Thompson Initiative, transforming service through equity, stood Dr. Marcus Thompson, alongside CEO James Harrison. Contrast between them was striking yet complementary. Distinguished academic, whose quiet dignity had catalyzed movement, and corporate leader, who had chosen systemic change rather than crisis management. Welcome to official launch of Thompson Initiative. Harrison began addressing diverse audience with evident sincerity. 3 months ago, incident aboard aircraft revealed fundamental flaws in our service model, flaws that allowed bias to influence critical decisions about who belongs in which spaces and whose rights deserve protection. He paused, making eye contact with attendees across room. We could have treated incident as isolated failure, replaced one employee, issued apology, and continued business as usual. Many organizations facing similar reckonings choose that path. Instead, guided by Dr. Thompson's expertise and powerful advocacy of his students, we've chosen to address root systems that enabled discrimination despite stated policies against it. Screen behind them shifted to display initiative's core components, not vague commitments, but specific measurable structural changes. First, Harrison continued, we've implemented complete overhaul of seating verification protocols. Every passenger's boarding pass is now electronically verified against master system before seat assignment is confirmed, with no exceptions based on status, appearance, or frequency of travel. Flight attendant in audience nodded approvingly, recognizing how procedural change removed discretionary judgments that allowed bias to influence Victoria's actions. Second, we've instituted comprehensive data collection and analysis to identify patterns in passenger treatment. Every complaint, upgrade, downgrade, and service interaction is now tracked with demographic information, allowing us to identify and address disparities before they become systemic. Daniel Reyes, seated in third row, smiled slightly. Business major had contributed significantly to designing these metrics during summer internship with Transatlantic's newly formed Equity Compliance Division. Third, Harrison continued, we've established independent passenger advocacy board with real authority, including power to audit internal practices, review training materials, and recommend binding policy changes. This board includes travel experts, civil rights attorneys, and most importantly, passengers who have experienced discrimination firsthand. In front row, Maya Johnson listened attentively. She had recently accepted position as student representative on that very board, bringing legal knowledge and lived experience to oversight process. But perhaps most significantly, Harrison said tone, reflecting genuine pride, we've fundamentally restructured training approach. Instead of treating equity as separate module or compliance requirement, we've integrated it throughout operational training as core service quality issue. Dr. Thompson stepped forward to explain this critical component. What makes Thompson Initiative different from typical corporate diversity programs, he explained with professorial clarity, is that it doesn't treat bias as perception problem to be managed through improved communication. Instead, it recognizes bias as operational failure that compromises service quality for all passengers. He clicked to next slide, showing training simulation in progress. Every transatlantic employee now experiences what we call perspective reversal training, immersive scenarios where they personally experience impact of having presence questioned, credentials doubted, or rights minimized. This creates not just intellectual understanding, but emotional recognition of how discretionary judgments affect passenger dignity. The training footage showed flight attendants participating in role-play scenario, where they were subjected to same treatment Dr. Thompson experienced having valid tickets questioned, being asked to step aside, while others passed through watching as their credentials were scrutinized, while others were accepted without verification. The response has been powerful. Dr. Thompson continued. Many employees emerged from these simulations with profound recognition of patterns they hadn't previously noticed in their own behavior. One such employee was present in audience, Victoria Palmer herself. After disastrous television interview and subsequent social media backlash, she had undergone remarkable personal transformation. Initially defensive and unable to see patterns in her actions, Victoria had eventually experienced what psychologists call perspective shift, genuine recognition of how her unexamined assumptions had shaped her behavior. Rather than terminating her employment completely, Transatlantic had offered opportunity for her to become part of solution. After completing extensive training and demonstrating genuine understanding of structural issues, Victoria now worked with training department, sharing her experience as cautionary example and participating in development of verification protocols specifically designed to eliminate discretionary bias. As presentation continued, Harrison shared initial data showing initiative's measurable impact. Complaint data revealed significant decreases in reports of discriminatory treatment since implementing new verification protocols. Employee satisfaction scores improved, with staff reporting less stress when clear procedures removed ambiguous judgment calls. Airline's Net Promoter Score had increased 11 points, with particularly notable improvements among minority passengers. Transformation wasn't merely internal. Transatlantic's approach had begun influencing industry standards, with 3 other major carriers announcing similar verification protocols and training overhauls. When formal presentation concluded, events shifted to panel discussion, featuring flight attendants, gate agents, and passengers discussing real-world implementation. The panel included surprise participant Victoria Palmer herself, speaking publicly for first time since ill-fated television interview. The hardest part, she acknowledged with humility, that had been absent from her earlier defenses, was recognizing that bias doesn't require malicious intent. I didn't see myself as treating passengers differently based on appearance. But when I was required to analyze my own patterns objectively, data was undeniable. Her candid self-reflection, acknowledging both resistance and eventual recognition, provided powerful complement to initiative's structural focus. It demonstrated how individual transformation could parallel institutional change when approached with honesty rather than defensiveness. During reception that followed, Sophia Alvarez found herself speaking with Elise Harrington, executive, whose presence on Flight 237 had helped catalyze initial intervention. I have to admit, Elise confessed, when we first started discussing changes, there was significant resistance. Concerns about efficiency, cost, passenger experience for elite members. Usual objections to meaningful change. What turned tide? Sophia asked, curious about internal dynamics that allowed substantial reform. 2 things, Elise explained. First, data was irrefutable. When we conducted thorough analysis of service patterns, disparities were so clear, even most skeptical executives couldn't dismiss them. Second, Harrison framed equity as competitive advantage rather than compliance requirement. He showed how consistent verification-based treatment created operational efficiency while reducing complaints and litigation risk. Suddenly, business case aligned perfectly with ethical imperative. Across room, Dr. Thompson engaged in conversation with Harrison and board members. Professor's influence had extended far beyond initial incident. He had become trusted advisor, whose sociological expertise was reshaping corporate practices at fundamental level. True measure of initiative's success. Dr. Thompson explained, won't be immediate impact, but sustainability after spotlight fades. Real institutional change outlasts crisis that catalyzed it. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That's why we've built accountability metrics into executive compensation. 20% of leadership bonuses now tied to equity performance indicators. We've aligned financial incentives with values we claim to uphold. As reception continued, Trevor Williams circulated through crowd camera documenting milestone for project that had evolved from student film to commissioned work. Airline had taken unusual step of granting him full creative control, recognizing that authentic documentation carried more credibility than managed messaging. Most powerful moment came when newly hired flight attendant approached Dr. Thompson with tears in eyes. I wanted to thank you, she said, voice slightly trembling. I've been in aviation 15 years and experienced other side of what happened being pressured to apply discretionary judgment that often meant treating passengers differently based on appearances. New approach doesn't just protect passengers, it protects us from becoming instruments of discrimination. Her testimony captured initiative's deeper impact, how systemic reform created space for individual integrity, allowing employees to align personal values with professional practice, rather than forcing impossible choice between them. As event concluded and attendees dispersed to breakout sessions, tangible sense of genuine transformation lingered. Thompson Initiative represented something rare in corporate America. Crisis response, transcending damage control, to become fundamental reform PR necessity, evolving into operational excellence. Most importantly, it demonstrated how theory could become practice, how sociological concepts taught in university classrooms could reshape institutional structures when applied with clarity, courage, and commitment. The grand auditorium of International Sociology Conference in Paris was filled beyond capacity. Attendees stood along walls, sat cross-legged in aisles clustered at entrances, straining to hear. What had been scheduled as academic keynote on structural inequality had transformed into cultural moment convergence of theory and lived experience that captured global attention. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood at podium, dignified presence, magnified by events of past week. Behind him sat students no longer merely attendees, but active participants in case study that had moved from abstract to visceral. Good morning, he began, warm baritone filling hall without need for amplification. My original address was titled, Invisible Architectures, How Structural Inequality Persists in Post-Policy Environments. That remains our topic, though recent events have provided rather unexpected practical demonstration. Knowing laughter rippled through audience. Video from Flight 237 had spread throughout academic circles, with particular resonance among sociologists who studied precisely these patterns. For 30 years, Dr. Thompson continued, I have taught students to recognize gap between formal policies and lived realities, how institutions can simultaneously prohibit discrimination while enabling it through discretionary enforcement, subjective judgment, and unwritten norms about who belongs in which spaces. He paused, adjusting glasses with slight smile. Yesterday, theory met practice at 35,000 feet. Simple statement, carried profound weight. Scholars who spent careers analyzing such dynamics rarely witnessed them so clearly documented with consequences so immediately visible. What occurred offers several critical insights. Dr. Thompson continued shifting into analytical framework that had earned him respect throughout field. First, it demonstrates how gatekeeping functions through seemingly neutral procedural decisions. How Victoria Palmer's selective application of verification protocols became mechanism for enforcing unspoken boundaries. On screen behind him appeared still image from Trevor's video moment, when Palmer scrutinized Dr. Thompson's boarding pass while waving Richard Whitfield through. Second, it illustrates how privilege operates not through explicit claims of superiority, but through assumptions of belonging, unexamined expectation that certain spaces are naturally designated for certain bodies. Another image appeared Richard's indignant expression declaring, "I always sit in 2A. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Dr. Thompson continued, "It reveals how systems respond when challenged initially with resistance, then accommodation, and finally, if sufficient pressure applied with structural reconsideration." Analysis was meticulous, transforming personal experience into academic framework without diminishing emotional reality. Dr. Thompson was modeling precisely what he taught: how to recognize patterns, name them accurately, analyze their structural foundations. But there is another dimension to what happened. He said, tone shifting, one that transcends academic analysis and speaks to something more fundamental about human dignity and collective action. He looked toward students' expression reflecting genuine appreciation. When these 20 remarkable young people stood up, literally stood up, they demonstrated something profound about how theory becomes practice. They didn't just recognize injustice, they refused complicity. They transformed education from intellectual understanding to moral action. Students straightened in their seats, weight of acknowledgement visible in their expressions. For many in audience, this aspect collective response of students applying education in real time was as compelling as discrimination itself. Their intervention offers powerful lesson. Dr. Thompson continued, "Academic knowledge without moral courage remains abstract intellectual without being transformative." These students reminded me, and now all of us, that ultimate purpose of studying structural inequality isn't just to understand it, but to dismantle it. Auditorium was absolutely silent, hundreds of scholars absorbing case study bridging gap between academic theory and lived reality. What comes next is equally instructive. Dr. Thompson explained, describing transatlantic airways response not as corporate damage control, but opportunity for institutional learning. He outlined Thompson Initiative without self-aggrandizement, focusing on how it exemplified translation of sociological principles into operational practice. Verification protocols, data collection systems, and training approaches being implemented represent structural solutions to structural problems, addressing not just individual behavior, but systems that shape, constrain, and direct that behavior. As he continued weaving theoretical frameworks with practical applications, Dr. Thompson helped audience understand how academic insights could inform real-world change when properly translated and implemented. When he concluded formal address, applause was immediate and sustained not polite academic acknowledgement, but genuine recognition they had witnessed something extraordinary scholar, whose theoretical work catalyzed practical change in real time. Question period that followed was equally powerful. Scholars from around world engaged not just with Dr. Thompson's framework, but with students who applied it. Sophia articulated moment of decision with analytical precision. Trevor explained how documentation transformed subjective experience into objective evidence. Maya connected incident to broader patterns of discretionary enforcement across multiple institutions. Zoe Chen, typically reserved in academic settings, surprised herself by raising hand and speaking with newfound confidence. "What I learned," she explained, "is that those of us who normally stay silent are part of system too. My quietness was comfortable, but comfort can be complicity. Finding my voice was terrifying and liberating at the same time." Her candid reflection on personal transformation received its own wave of applause, resonating with many who recognized themselves in her journey from observer to participant. By time session concluded, it was clear to everyone present that what occurred transcended single incident or viral video moment. It represented rare and powerful convergence of theory and practice moment when academic understanding translated into moral action and institutional change. As attendees filed out, many approached students to express admiration or ask questions. Several department chairs quietly extended business cards with invitations to consider graduate programs. Journal editors inquired about potential articles documenting experience from students' perspectives. For Dr. Thompson, watching students engage with senior scholars as peers, rather than mere students' pride, was profound but complicated by reflection. Throughout career, he had taught theories explaining what happened on flight. He had published papers analyzing mechanisms that Victoria Palmer and Richard Whitfield enacted. He had equipped generations to recognize such patterns, but it had taken painful personal experience, momentary but searing denial of humanity, and belonging to transform lifetime of teaching from abstract principle to lived reality for these 20 students. There was both triumph and poignancy in recognition, understanding that some lessons, no matter how well taught, require lived experience to fully comprehend. Later that evening, alone in his hotel room, Dr. Thompson sat at desk overlooking Parisian lights. The adrenaline of public presentation had faded, leaving space for more personal reflection. He opened journal and began writing. Today, I presented academic analysis of what happened on Flight 237, maintaining professional composure expected of keynote speaker. What I couldn't share publicly was raw vulnerability of that moment, feeling viscerally what I've studied intellectually for decades. The familiar tightening in chest when Victoria scrutinized my boarding pass. The cold weight of recognition as Richard claimed my seat without verification. The silent calculation about whether to challenge system or accept indignity for sake of peace. These aren't academic observations, but lived realities that no scholarly framework fully captures. Perhaps most painful was recognizing that lifetime of professional accomplishment, books, awards, professorship provided no shield against being seen as inherently out of place in first-class cabin. Yet alongside this pain came unexpected gift, watching students transform theory into action without hesitation. Their courage brings hope. Their solidarity brings tears I couldn't show publicly. Perhaps most meaningful education happened not in my lecture, but in aircraft aisle, where theory became necessity and students chose to stand. The private reflection captured what public address couldn't. Emotional reality beneath analytical framework. Personal vulnerability behind professional composure. This balance between personal experience and structural analysis would become hallmark of Thompson Initiative, ensuring reforms addressed systems while honoring dignity of individuals affected by them. Exactly 1 year after events aboard Flight 237, Dr. Marcus Thompson found himself at JFK International boarding Transatlantic Airways flight to Paris. Symmetry was deliberate. He had been invited to deliver closing address at International Sociology Conference, reflecting on year of transformation following his keynote presentation 12 months earlier. Terminal experience already reflected significant changes. At check-in counter, every passenger's identification was verified against electronic manifest, using same standardized procedure regardless of appearance or status. Boarding process included clear announcements about verification protocols and presence of passenger advocates in distinctive blue vests available to address concerns before escalation. As Dr. Thompson approached gate agent, she scanned his boarding pass with practiced efficiency. "Good afternoon, Dr. Thompson. Your boarding pass for seat 2A has been verified. Have a pleasant flight." Simple transaction. Unremarkable inconsistency. Represented precisely kind of structural change Thompson Initiative implemented. It wasn't about special treatment, but standardized procedures preventing disparate treatment. Boarding aircraft. Dr. Thompson was greeted by flight attendant who recognized him immediately, not from viral video, but from training program. "Dr. Thompson," she said warmly, "it's honor to have you aboard. I'm Alicia Martinez. Your case study was central to my training 6 months ago. Protocols you helped develop have made my job both clearer and more fulfilling." Her recognition wasn't deferential or apologetic, but professional and appreciative, acknowledging contribution to institutional improvement rather than focusing on discrimination experienced. As Dr. Thompson settled into seat 2A, he noticed subtle but significant changes throughout first-class cabin. Signage clearly explained verification procedures in multiple languages. QR codes offered direct access to passenger advocacy system. Safety briefing included brief statement about transatlantic's commitment to equitable service. Midway through flight, senior flight attendant approached respectfully. Dr. Thompson, I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Michael Rodriguez Purser, who became involved in your situation last year. I wanted to thank you personally for how you've helped transform our airline. Dr. Thompson set aside laptop, recognizing Michael from confrontation 12 months earlier. Good to see you again under better circumstances. Changes have been remarkable, Michael continued, keeping voice low. Before Thompson Initiative, we operated with so many unwritten rules and subjective judgments. Verification protocols removed burden of discretion that often put us in impossible positions. His perspective highlighted how reforms benefited employees as much as passengers, creating clarity where ambiguity had previously forced individual staff to navigate complex situations without adequate guidance. Most meaningful change, Michael added, is how we now measure service quality. Consistency and equity are core metrics, not separate diversity considerations. It's transformed how we understand fundamental responsibilities to all passengers. As conversation concluded and Michael returned to duties, Dr. Thompson reflected on journey of past year, how painful personal experience had catalyzed institutional change, now benefiting thousands of passengers and employees daily. Structural reforms weren't about him specifically, but addressing systems that made his experience both possible and probable. When aircraft touched down in Paris, there was no media fanfare, no special recognition, just ordinary process of deplaning exactly as it should be. Success of Thompson Initiative wasn't measured in exceptional moments, but consistent, equitable experiences, no longer requiring extraordinary intervention. Walking through Charles de Gaulle Airport toward taxi stand, Dr. Thompson passed familiar face, Richard Whitfield, rolling carry-on while speaking intensely into phone. Their eyes met briefly, moment of mutual recognition. Richard hesitated, perhaps considering whether to acknowledge Dr. Thompson or pretend not to see him. After moments' consideration, Richard gave slight, uncomfortable nod. Not exactly apology, but minimal acknowledgement of shared history. Dr. Thompson returned gesture with simple dignity before continuing on his way. Brief, wordless exchange carried its own significance. Recognition without reconciliation, acknowledgement without resolution. Outside terminal, settling into taxi, headed for conference venue, Dr. Thompson reflected on how systems shape individual behavior, how Richard Whitfield's entitled expectations and Victoria Palmer's discriminatory assessments had been enabled and encouraged by institutional structures rewarding certain forms of judgment while obscuring discriminatory impacts. Thompson Initiative wasn't about punishing individuals, but reforming systems, creating structures where equity wasn't dependent on personal virtue or awareness, but embedded in operational practices and verification protocols. It recognized meaningful change required addressing root causes rather than merely symptoms. As taxi merged into Parisian traffic, Dr. Thompson opened laptop to review closing address one final time. Title slide read, From Incident to Institution: How Individual Experience Becomes Structural Change. It was both academic analysis and personal testimony bridge between theory and practice, reflecting unique journey from subject to catalyst in process of institutional transformation. In that moment, as Paris flowed past window and thoughts organized for address to come, Dr. Marcus Thompson felt something transcending both professional satisfaction and personal vindication. Quiet recognition that education at its most meaningful doesn't just explain world, but helps transform it, not through grandiose revolutions, but patient, persistent work of making visible what was hidden and addressing what has been revealed. 3 years after Flight 237, Dr. Thompson stood before packed lecture hall at Westlake University, teaching opening session of his advanced seminar, Structural Inequality in Modern Society. Course that once prepared 20 students for academic conference, now attracted over 100 applicants for 30 spots, reputation transformed by real-world application of theoretical framework. Today we begin with case study, demonstrating how systems of inequality operate through seemingly neutral procedures. Dr. Thompson explained familiar tweed jacket and measured voice unchanged despite international recognition. We'll examine how discretionary enforcement creates disparate experiences despite formally equal policies. On projection screen appeared still image from Trevor Williams's video moment when Victoria Palmer scrutinized Dr. Thompson's boarding pass while Richard Whitfield was waved through without verification. What had been painful personal experience had transformed into educational material teaching tool making abstract concepts concretely visible. Thompson Initiative has become standard curriculum in sociology programs worldwide, but significance extends beyond academic analysis. Dr. Thompson continued, "It now informs operational practices across service industries, demonstrating how theoretical understanding can translate into practical reform." Case study had indeed transcended origins to become framework for understanding and addressing discretionary discrimination in multiple contexts. Healthcare systems implemented verification-based protocols for triage and treatment authorization. Financial institutions standardized loan application reviews to reduce subjective assessments. Retail organizations reformed security monitoring practices to prevent disparate scrutiny based on appearance. Most significantly, CASE had entered sociology textbooks, not merely as example of discrimination, but as model for effective response. How collective action, strategic documentation, and structural analysis could transform individual incidents into institutional change. It had become standard teaching tool, demonstrating how academic concepts could be applied to real-world situations. After class, students approached Dr. Thompson with particular enthusiasm of those encountering living connection to material previously studied only in texts. Dr. Thompson, one asked eagerly, "How has your perspective on structural inequality evolved since Flight 237 incident? Has direct experience changed how you understand theories you've taught for years?" It was thoughtful question deserving considered response. Dr. Thompson reflected before answering. "Fundamental theories remain sound," he explained, "but lived experience added 3 dimensions that influenced my teaching significantly. First, it illuminated emotional weight of navigating systems designed to question belonging, something academic analysis often understates. Second, it demonstrated how quickly theoretical understanding can translate to practical action when patterns are recognized clearly. Third, it revealed how structural change becomes possible when individual incidents are connected to systemic patterns through proper documentation and analysis." As students nodded thoughtfully, absorbing integration of theory and experience, Dr. Thompson added, "Final observation. Capturing most profound legacy of Flight 237. Perhaps most importantly, what happened transformed standing up from metaphor to literal action. My students that day didn't just recognize injustice intellectually, they physically stood in aircraft aisle, refusing to be seated until dignity was respected. That literal standing became powerful symbol of how education at its best creates not just understanding, but courage to act on that understanding." Thompson case had indeed become more than academic reference point. It evolved into framework for understanding how systems operate through discretion, how discrimination functions through seemingly neutral procedures, and how collective action creates accountability that individual vulnerability cannot. But its most enduring legacy wasn't in textbooks or training programs. It lived in decisions of those who witnessed or studied it, passengers who spoke up when observing selective enforcement employees, questioning disparate verification practices, students recognizing patterns their education equipped them to name and address. Case, beginning with 20 students standing for professor, became template for standing literally and figuratively against systems enabling discrimination through unexamined discretion and selective application of ostensibly neutral rules. In transformation from incident to institution, from personal experience to educational framework, events aboard Flight 237 achieved what best education seeks, not merely understanding world, but helping change it. One recognized pattern and courageous stand at time. The footage from Flight 237 concludes with powerful image. 20 students standing united in aircraft aisle, diverse faces reflecting determination and solidarity as they advocate for professors' dignity. Over this final frame, Dr. Thompson's voice speaks directly to viewers. What you've witnessed isn't just about one seat on one flight or one professor's experience. It's about fundamental question we all face. When we recognize injustice, do we observe it or challenge it? When systems enable discrimination through seemingly neutral procedures, do we accept those systems or transform them? Camera slowly zooms out, expanding frame, to show not just students, but wider context. Other passengers watching some uncomfortable, some supportive, all witnessing moment when education translated directly into action. These students didn't just study structural inequality. They recognized it in real time and refused to be complicit. Their education became meaningful precisely when it moved from theory to practice, from recognition to response. Screen transitions to present-day footage of verification procedures implemented across multiple service contexts. Airlines, hospitals, banks, retail establishments with clear protocols replacing discretionary judgment. When we stand together, injustice cannot stand at all. This isn't abstract idealism, but practical reality. Changes implemented after Flight 237 demonstrate how collective action can transform individual vulnerability into institutional accountability. Final sequence returns to Dr. Thompson in university classroom, surrounded by new generation of students engaged in ongoing work of recognizing and addressing systems of inequality. As you continue your journey, remember this fundamental truth. Dignity isn't just demanded. Sometimes it must be defended by all of us. Patterns these students recognized exist in countless contexts where discretion becomes discrimination, where belonging is questioned based on appearance rather than verification, where some receive scrutiny while others receive assumption. Dr. Thompson looks directly into camera expression, reflecting both wisdom of academic analysis and lived experience of personal dignity challenged and defended. Question isn't whether you'll encounter such patterns. Question is what you'll do when you recognize them. Will you observe them academically, or will you stand literally and figuratively for dignity that belongs to everyone, regardless of how they look, or whether they match expectations about who belongs in which spaces? Screen fades to simple black background with white text. When dignity faces discrimination, where will you stand? That's the end of our powerful story. If you found it moving or thought-provoking, please hit that like button right now. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that sparks important conversations. Subscribe to our channel to never miss our weekly stories about courage, dignity, and standing up for what's right. We deliver compelling narratives that entertain while tackling real social issues. Share this video with someone who might need courage today, or someone who works in education, corporate training, or service industries. The lessons from Dr. Thompson's experience can transform how we all approach fairness and dignity in everyday interactions. Remember, change starts with awareness and courage. Be that person who stands up when it matters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.